Good morning, and welcome to the University of Alberta portion of the Around the World Conference on Privacy and Surveillance in the Digital Age. This is the second Around the World Conference hosted by the Cool Institute for Advanced Study. This year, we have speakers from 11 countries, including Nigeria, the Netherlands, Japan, Australia, Italy, Israel, Germany, Brazil, United States, and of course, Canada. And in fact, those of you who've been tuning in have probably heard some fabulous panels from around the world. I want to say a few words about this conference. It is an experiment in many ways. It's an experiment for us to figure out how to connect people from so many different countries with so many different technological solutions at their ends. It's also an experiment in how to move ideas without necessarily creating an on-site conference. I'm very fortunate to have here at the University of Alberta a distinguished panel to address the issue of privacy and surveillance. What's going to happen here is I'm going to briefly introduce them all. They're each going to spend about 5 minutes talking about themselves and some of the issues that they think are important. And then we have a series of prepared questions, and I will start asking these questions of some of our panelists. I'm hoping that they will disagree and begin to respond to each other. We have plenty of time for a good conversation. If any of you want to participate, think of using the hashtag, #UofAWorld. Or there is, on the online website, there is a spot where you can leave a comment, which will go to an email address that's being watched, and we'll gather the comments and so on like that, and try to address them here. If we can't address them during the panel, we hope to address them later on through the Twitter stream, or probably through the Twitter stream. I should also mention that all of these panels, all of the discussions over the day are going to be archived. If you return to this site in about a week, you will see that, that we have archival versions up as we're able to craft them. We in fact have archived last year's session if you want to return to this. So my speakers, starting to my right, Stephen Penny is from the Faculty of Law and the Associate Dean for Research. Jill Clayton is the Alberta Privacy Commissioner. My name is Jeffrey Rockwell. I'm the Director of the Cool Institute for Advanced Study. Sarah Tinich is in Media Studies in the Department of Sociology, and Kevin Haggerty studies surveillance, also in the Department of Sociology. So, Stephen, over to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Jeffrey. My background is in the regulation of police, and in particular, privacy-invasive technologies and surveillance techniques, among other things. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about, I think, 3 themes that hopefully we'll follow up on in one form or another in our conversation here today. And the first question is perhaps to start a conversation about what kind of privacy, or what kinds of privacy are we really talking about at a conference like this? And privacy is one of these terms that is very difficult to pin down and define. It depends very often according to context. But I'm assuming that most of what we're talking about is a particular type of privacy that we most often call information privacy, and even perhaps a narrower subtype of informational privacy, and that's invasions of informational privacy that are not particularly physically invasive. So we're talking about information about identifiable individuals collected often from third parties, or if it's collected directly from the subject, it's usually done so remotely without the knowledge of the data holder or the subject. And I think it's useful to contrast this kind of privacy invasion with privacy invasions that take place hundreds or perhaps thousands of times a day in any city in Western democracies. And these are privacy invasions of usually young men by police who are minding their own business, walking down the street or driving in a vehicle. And these young men are not exclusively, but disproportionately members of disadvantaged groups, often racial minorities, and also disproportionately poor. And the kinds of privacy invasions that take place in those circumstances involve an informational component, but I would submit that the informational component is relatively minor compared to the physical intrusion, potential for racial discrimination or racial profiling, the indignity, the stigma, the inconvenience that comes with being often wrongfully identified or suspected of having committed a criminal act. And we don't usually talk about that in conferences like this because, quite frankly, very few people around this room or in the audience are likely to be subject to that kind of privacy invasion. But we might want to query whether that's actually a far greater or at least as significant societal problem than the kinds of electronic online privacy invasions that we tend to be preoccupied with in forums like this that tend to affect a much broader segment of the population and indeed probably disproportionately a relatively advantaged segment of the population in terms of socioeconomic status, level of education, access to technology, familiarity with technology, et cetera. The second theme that I want to talk about is whether privacy is most usefully conceived as a kind of fundamental right, a human right, a constitutional right, a legal right. And people who talk about privacy in these terms will almost always admit that privacy has to be sometimes traded off or balanced against collective societal concerns, law enforcement, counterterrorism, et cetera. But at the same time, privacy often retains a kind of status as a moral trump card, that it deserves a higher priority, it's a fundamental human right, and therefore, if we do have to trade it off, it's with regret and with constraint. And this is connected to the idea that privacy invasions involve some kind of intrinsic moral harm related to notions like dignity, autonomy, self-determination, freedom, individual freedom, et cetera. And I would submit that often this is not a particularly helpful way to think about privacy. In North America, at least, informational privacy is, descriptively speaking, not a fundamental human right. It is not a fundamental constitutional right. Constitutions in the United States and Canada do not speak of privacy, at least not explicitly. We only protect a right to be secure against unreasonable search and seizure. Now, of course, this does indirectly protect privacy, but always as a kind of cost-benefit trade-off against other collective interest. Now, another problem with the fundamental rights approach is that privacy turns out to be much more fundamental to some people than to others. So many social scientists, empirical researchers have found that privacy preferences and privacy behaviors vary tremendously among individuals, cross-culturally, historically, and perhaps most interestingly, depending on the immediate social context, the incentives, the way information is presented, et cetera. So one of the most famous privacy researchers, Alan Weston, has been conducting surveys for decades now that attempt to gauge people's baseline preferences in terms of the level of privacy protection that they prefer, their concern for privacy issues. And he's found, the numbers have varied over the decades, but there is a core of what he calls privacy fundamentalists, roughly a quarter of the population. And then there is a much larger segment who are privacy pragmatists, who are more interested in trading off and balancing, see privacy is important, but not necessarily fundamental. And then there's a sort of rump minority of people who really just don't care about privacy. They're not concerned. It's not a priority for them. And it's possible, this is speculative on my part and perhaps provocative, but that the audiences for these kinds of conferences, the experts who are interested in privacy, self-select and are disproportionately fundamentalists. And that might skew the debate and give perhaps a somewhat misleading picture of the population's general concern for privacy concerns. But I'm sure there'll be those on this panel who will take me up on that point. And this leads me to my last theme. And that's the question of how should we resolve or go about resolving the key privacy debates that we see occurring in our societies today. And as it flows from my submission that we ought not to think of privacy primarily as a fundamental moral right, that we ought to engage in a very rigorous, clear-headed cost-benefit analysis of the costs and benefits of privacy and the costs and benefits of surveillance. And this leads to a final question, which is, well, if we decide it's necessary to intervene to correct maybe a failure in the market or a flaw in the democratic process, then what is the best mechanism to do that? And one debate that I've been most concerned about in my research that concerns legal scholars in particular is when it's justified for courts to intervene to regulate privacy over and above the ordinary legislative majoritarian process. And I think that's a very interesting question that's been understudied because it involves a question of who is institutionally best suited to making these kinds of trade-offs. Is it the courts in some cases, or is it best left to the ordinary legislative process? So I'll stop there and turn it over to my peers.
Okay, well, those were some interesting and provocative comments from Stephen. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'm really pleased to be participating on this panel. I think these are important issues that that are deserving of this kind of discussion. As Jeffrey has already said, my name is Jill Clayton. I'm the Information and Privacy Commissioner for the province of Alberta in Canada. I've been in this role since February of 2010, although I've been with the office prior to that for another 7 years, I think it was. As Information and Privacy Commissioner, I am a nonpartisan independent officer of the legislature. So I and my office are independent of the government of the day, which is important because as Information and Privacy Commissioner, I have oversight for 3 access and privacy laws in the province. The first one, and the oldest, if you will, the senior statute, is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, which is legislation that applies to the public sector, so provincial government, municipalities in the province, and other local government bodies and other public bodies. The second statute is the Health Information Act. Alberta is one of the first provinces to have introduced standalone health information legislation. So that statute is specifically about information sharing, frankly, within the health sector, but also protection of privacy of that health information. And then the third statute applies in our private sector, and that's the Personal Information Protection Act. And again applies to businesses, so provincially regulated private sector businesses. And just to provide a little bit of context, primarily what the office is engaged in, or has been engaged in certainly for the last 20 years or so since it was established, a main core business, if you will, is resolving privacy complaints and ensuring that individuals have that their rights to access information held by government bodies are upheld, and also ensuring that individuals they do have a right under legislation to access their own personal information or health information. So primarily, a core function of the office is to investigate complaints about collection, use, disclosure of personal information, and the safeguarding of personal information, and also to ensure access to information when that is a right that's being exercised under the law. So we have an informal component of mediation and investigation, but we're also a quasi-judicial administrative tribunal. So I do have the power to compel public bodies or health custodians or private sector businesses to comply with the legislation. We also have an education mandate and a research mandate, and a mandate to inform individuals about their rights under access and privacy legislation. So as I mentioned, I've been with the office for a total of probably about 10 years and just over 2 years in the role of commissioner. Before joining the office, I was a consultant. I worked in the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector, assisting organizations and public bodies to comply with the legislation. In terms of some issues that just be very high level, but obviously some of the key challenges as a regulator in today's environment, one of the key ones is, of course, ubiquitous technology and the rapid pace of development and innovation. We're a regulator with limited resources, trying to stay on top of what is happening in the public, private, and health sectors in terms of technological innovation can be very challenging. Also, the idea that if we can, we should, or we must. So we have this technology, we can implement it. People often get very caught up in the excitement of all of that without giving perhaps due regard to thinking things through, planning, should we, asking that question in the first place, identifying risks to privacy and how to mitigate those risks. And a second challenge or key issue that I think is starting to define privacy in Alberta, but also across Canada and perhaps internationally, is the idea of information sharing and between the three sectors, public, private, and health. In Alberta, as I've mentioned, there are 3 separate laws that regulate each of those sectors. Increasingly, we're starting to see joint initiatives where information is crossing those boundaries. And of course, information sharing, I understand that, and this obviously ties in with the idea of surveillance. There are all sorts of benefits. Information is vital to provide all kinds of programs and services to individuals. But again, there are certain issues that go along with that. How are these partnerships being governed, information governance? Do we need to do it? What kind of planning is there? What kind of coordination? And again, what are the privacy risks and how are they being mitigated? And both the ubiquitous technology and information sharing lead to questions that I have around transparency of these kinds of initiatives and how do individuals exercise their rights under access and privacy laws when information is being shared, this kind of flow of information and with these new technologies. So those are some of the issues that I'm interested in. Thank you.
Yes. When we talk about privacy, surveillance, et cetera, and I think many of my colleagues are coming at this from issues of economics, politics on the ground. And so I want to connect my area of interest within this broader question to a point that Stephen raised about information. As someone who researches and teaches in the area of media, when I think about privacy issues, it's very much connected to new technologies. Of course, the increasing and exponential growth of social media forums and what that means in terms of increased visibility of individuals, both to governments, to larger publics, but importantly to corporations, and particularly how people are increasingly sort of voluntarily divulging information about themselves, often unknowingly, as they participate in what they consider to be public spaces, but which are very much corporate spaces. If we look at something like a Twitter, a Facebook, Instagram, all sorts of personal interactions that are very much about connecting with communities across virtual geographies, but are also being conducted in spaces where information is being aggregated, collected, and sold about processes within these new digital spheres. So in this respect, my contribution might be seen as looking at some of the contradictions about issues of privacy and surveillance in a new media age. And when I say contradictions, it's because I'm not one to say that any sort of new trend in surveillance and privacy is, I don't want to come at it from a normative position of it's all very, promising or all very dystopian and evil where we now live in some sort of big brother society. Rather, there are contradictions both in practices and theories of our new media age that tend to sort of sit on two ends of a spectrum. One that sees these new technologies as very much emblematic of a new form of empowerment, of participatory culture, where citizens are able to contribute to the generation and circulation of information. But at the other end is this concern about the fact that we are now more visible than we have ever been before. Everything from what you may send to an Instagram, which also becomes the property now of Instagram, or post on a Facebook page, et cetera, becomes, again, proprietary to those corporations. However, new technologies also enable citizens to become producers in a way that they've never had the opportunity to participate in terms of cultural production, but political discourse as well. So my interest in this larger, if we look at it as an intervention into privacy and surveillance concerns, is to look at these contradictions as always and simultaneously working with one another. How much privacy do we knowingly realize that we're, forsaking in a new media age, versus what's happening in the background in terms of the corporate collection of information about our participation that we have no idea, that is invisible to us. So what are we sacrificing in those particular moments? Also, when we look at debates between new forms of participatory culture, whether it's do-it-yourself media forms, social media, versus the collection of information about ourselves as consumers and citizens under surveillance. Where is that point in which we need to begin to sort of socialize ourselves into forms of self-surveillance in terms of becoming more responsible for the protection of our own privacy? Because realizing that in the corporate world, this has, new media technologies have actually led to new forms of knowledge that the media industries, as well as the new digital industries, have long been seeking in terms of being able to create psychodemographic profiles, as well as consumer profiles, et cetera, to basically transform citizens into bits and bytes of information that can then really just position us as docile consumers. So in terms of that, I would like to sort of discuss these larger industrial structural powers versus those of the ordinary citizen in terms of both being able to maintain the power of participatory culture, but also in many ways begin to sort of circumscribe our own contributions to this so that we can also better control that information that begins to circulate globally across virtual geographies and particularly into powerful institutions.
My turn, I guess. I guess first, thanks to Jeffrey Rockwell and the Kies Institute for organizing this quite innovative and interesting panel on an important topic. My name is Kevin Haggerty. I'm a professor of sociology and criminology here at the University of Alberta. And in some ways, I guess I'm a surveillance generalist. I study surveillance. I started out originally studying policing institutions, and over the years I've just become more and more interested in surveillance in many different contexts. That includes policing, regulation, the family, warfare. I've written on theories of surveillance, so I really have a broad interest in surveillance generally. And I think the starting point, just to put a couple things on the table, at least from where I'm coming from, is when I talk about surveillance, most people, when you start talking about surveillance, they immediately think about, spies, James Bond, or else the police. And those are certainly part of the picture, but if you're going to have a full, rounded image of what's going on in the world of surveillance, you have to think about some of the things we've been talking about here. You have to think about the internet. You have to think about Web 2.0. You have to think about CCTV cameras. You have to think about self-surveillance, warfare, et cetera. And my standard position now for some years has been that I think we're actually in the midst of a world historical transformation in the dynamics of surveillance and visibility. This is a monumental transformation that we're just kind of getting our head around in terms of the ability to see new things, for organizations to see us in levels of detail that are historically just unprecedented. And this is going to change everything. This will change how we raise our children. This will change how we fight our wars, how we secure our borders, how we deliver education, how we deliver healthcare. This ability to see and be seen will touch every facet of our lives and our children's lives. So this is not something that is some esoteric topic. Pretty much any area of interest that you have is probably about to be influenced and shaped by dynamics and surveillance. So a couple, picking up on some of the themes that have been mentioned here, things that I find interesting and sort of to play off on. I think one of the important things to think about is that while there is this expansion of surveillance in lots of different realms, there are also asymmetries in the dynamics of surveillance, particularly asymmetries in terms of the ability of organizations to see and learn about individuals as compared to the ability of individuals to learn about organizations. And this has certainly been one of the more important dynamics since 9/11, where we've seen, certainly in North America, a whole range of pieces of legislation that have empowered organizations to collect information about citizens. But at the exact same time, you've seen those, often the exact same pieces of legislation seek to curtail the ability of individuals to know how is that information being used? How is it being collected? What algorithms are being used? So this is important because surveillance ultimately is a power resource. Surveillance is ultimately about power. It allows people to protect themselves or to exert force, coercion, manipulation, pressure on other groups. And when you have these massive asymmetries in visibility, you have essentially the makings of asymmetries of power. And that's may or may not map onto issues about privacy. Some of these new types of visibility may not violate any privacy laws, but they still mark a change in the dynamics of power that I think that we're all going to have to think about. And I'll have lots more to say, but I think that's just a good place to start.
Great. Well, I want to start by asking Sarah and Kevin, what things have changed recently? This sort of follows on your point about revolutionary change. Can you point to some concrete things that have changed, or maybe some things that haven't changed in privacy and surveillance?
Do you want to?
You go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, what's changed? I think it's almost impossible to think of what hasn't changed. So there's almost every sphere of our existence is now open to scrutiny to various degrees. But certainly if you think about my colleagues and I just published a book called, what did we call it? The New Transparency, Surveillance in Canada, which part of that we provide a vignette of a little girl, 11-year-old girl, and it starts off with her getting up in the morning and going to school and ultimately taking a trip back to her family's native Iran. And essentially you see from the moment she wakes up, she's playing online video games, she's going to school where there are cameras, there's online recording of her activities, of what she buys at school. The cell phone tracks her in real time. The cameras in the taxi cabs, the cameras in the airports in Canada that now are also being augmented to allow for audio recording in airports. So it's almost everywhere. That it's hard to imagine that where this doesn't exist. And in privacy, in some respect, we think about privacy as law often. We think about this as privacy as regulation, but I think that there's also a really important aspect of privacy, which is just about the day-to-day lived reality of privacy. How do you manage all of this scrutiny and monitoring? Do you shred papers? Do you close your blinds? Do you open the door? What emails do you open? All of that kind of banal day-to-day lived reality of surveillance, I think sociologists like Bourdieu would talk about this is increasingly part of our habitus, our day-to-day lived reality of almost unthinking relationship to how we manage information.
Julie Rack in last year's session talked about how we're all having to manage ourselves like celebrities. Yeah. We're all celebrities in some small scale.
Yeah, I was going to point to the issue of technological convergence, basically, that I want to go back and cite Carolyn Marvin's work when, she discusses how every new technology is discussed as if it's somehow revolutionizing society. And she argues that if we go back historically, that the telephone was the most revolutionary technology because it brought the public sphere into the most private area of the home. Now, if we fast forward to our present moment and we look at all the technologies that we engage with on a day-to-day basis, that are now indispensable to carrying out our jobs, our daily routines, whether we're talking about, the mobile phone, the computer, online video games, things that we think of as entertainment, the fact that televisions are now integrated with computer technologies, is that, if she was saying that the telephone was revolutionary because it violated the distinction between the public and the private, think about how much now that it's almost an indiscernible difference between what we define as private and as public. Almost everything that we're doing in that sort of most sacrosanct of spheres, the household, is now part of a two-way flow of information. Just sort of, things that you're innocuously surfing through something is going back to another sort of production source that is now, okay, I'm not creating sort of paranoid scenes where there's this person that is sitting there at the other end looking at you personally, but almost every moment of our lives has to now be considered as having a public dimension to it. And it's interesting, I think, when you bring up Julie's argument about we all become celebrities. Well, much of this is going to, I think, in the future become about sort of managing the presentation of self, knowing that you are always interacting in a larger public sphere. And a lot of this becomes discussed often in generational terms. We hear about the millennials, the digital natives, which I think really overstates, and I know that I've found this in my own research and teaching, overstates the amount of understanding that this generation actually has about the new technologies in the digital world. Just because they were sort of born into an era where they don't remember only having 3 TV stations doesn't mean that they are experts on actually managing their own privacy and visibility. And similarly with, when we talk about, the older generation as somehow being technologically illiterate, well, actually, often they come with much more concern about issues of visibility and privacy because to them there has been a seismic change. So I really think convergence culture and the fact that, industries and governments, et cetera, are, quite happy to continue sort of developing this inability to distinguish between the public and the private is, of course, going to be probably one of the most crucial concerns over all of these intersections of questions of visibility, privacy, and surveillance, and power, as Kevin brought up.
Do you guys want to add to this? Other thoughts?
Well, one thought is, the question of whether or not the capacity of surveillance mechanisms really translates into actual scrutiny by anyone. So the fact that there are cameras or recording devices or methods of aggregating data from multiple sources doesn't necessarily mean that anyone is watching you as an individual or cares anything about you as an individual. So I think we have to ask some further questions about who is actually using this stuff, why are they using it, and Kevin talked about power. Well, what does that really mean? Does it mean that we're on track towards an authoritarian state because we have surveillance? What is the causation relationship between surveillance and diminishment of democracy or move towards authoritarianism, et cetera? And so, I would probably argue that totalitarian and authoritarian states have vast surveillance apparatus because they are not democratic. And not they became authoritarian or totalitarian because they had a vast surveillance apparatus. It's the old adage, correlation does not mean causation. So I think the greatest tool that we have in our societies in the West and increasingly around the world is the democratic process. There are other mechanisms that may need to augment the protection of democracy, but as long as we have a reasonably well-functioning democratic process, then I don't think the big fears about surveillance are necessarily warranted.
So you've introduced the issue of fears, and Sarah was talking about generational differences or perhaps non-differences. So let me switch to questions about attitude. How have attitudes changed? Have citizens' attitudes changed? You started off by suggesting that there may, in fact, be a minority of people in this room, all of us in this room, who worry about this. Jill, do you want to, you actually deal with people concerned about these issues. Do you want to talk to that?
Of course. Well, first of all, I do agree with Stephen's opening comments, and when we talk about have citizens' attitudes changed, there is no citizens' attitude. Everybody has a different take on privacy. It's interesting, I participated in a roundtable discussion a couple of months ago involving children who had been in care. And there were a number of women who participated on that panel, and they were young women who had been involved in care, and this whole thing was about talking about information sharing and things like that, and whether or not there should be a publication ban on their families speaking out about them if something had gone wrong, or if, for example, they had died while in care. And it was interesting, there were the three women who were on the panel who had lived experience. They each spoke to what it would mean for them to be able to speak about their own experience or have their family speak about their own experience, and all three of them had a different take on that. One was, I want to be able to talk about it. This is my story. It's like I've never lived if I don't get to share that experience. And at the other extreme of that was a young woman who said, I have no interest in, well, it wasn't quite that extreme, but basically you saw that there are different takes on privacy. Privacy means different things to different people. So I don't know that there is one attitude. I agree with what Stephen has said, that there are those who are the privacy fundamentalists and the privacy pragmatists, and then some people who don't care much at all. My office did a survey, a general population survey last year. And we asked some questions to try to get some sort of read on whether or not the general population does care about privacy. And I think it came back at 97% of respondents said that yes, privacy is important, and it's important to protect personal information. The most important privacy issues for them were around hacking and identity theft, unauthorized access to their information by authorized individuals. So I think we'll be getting into this, but these large data warehouses, aggregated information, all of this information coming together, sometimes there is very broad access to that information, and rightly so. People need access in order to do their jobs. Sometimes people abuse that authorized access. So that was a big issue for them. And also I think the third most significant issue of the survey respondents that they identified had to do with privacy of children and youth. And certainly I think that's a response to hearing so much about young people today don't care about privacy. They'll put all of this information about themselves out there. They'll share it all on social media. So interestingly, I think it was about 27% of the respondents who said that they felt more secure about their privacy today than they did 5 years ago. I'm not sure what to make of that number. But in terms of privacy, I don't think it's fair to say that that generally people don't care about privacy. I think sometimes they care a great deal, particularly when they think privacy is getting in the way of them accomplishing something that they want. I can't do this without reading something and signing off, and this is a hassle for me. It gets in the way of my online purchase. It gets in the way of me executing an app on my smartphone. So there's those kinds of attitudes towards privacy. And certainly we've all seen the studies that say that individuals are willing to trade off privacy in order to get certain things. So I know that this has been replicated a number of times where somebody will stand on a street corner and offer people a $10 gift card or a chocolate bar or something like that if people will give up their social insurance number. And you'd be surprised at how many people are willing to do that kind of thing. And I think the survey results that when we ask people in the abstract if they care about privacy, then they say yes, that this is important to them. And I think that they understand that there is, it might not be a constitutional value of privacy, but actually in a case involving my office recently, the Supreme Court of Canada did say privacy is a quasi-constitutional value, and recognized that information privacy laws play a fundamental role in the preservation of a free and democratic society. It's that which allows individuals to have some control over their information and to act freely. I'm interested in the comment that Sarah made that everybody is managing the presentation of yourself. You know that you're being watched, and that has an effect on people's behavior, which to some extent may limit freedom. And ultimately, I think even where citizens might understand, in the abstract, that privacy is important, that it matters to us, that it's an important part of a free and democratic society, sometimes it's hard to hold on to that when you're dealing with something that might be a more visceral issue, like cyberbullying or terrorism or child pornography, that kind of thing, online child pornography. And at the end of the day, what we find in our office is that a lot of the people who say, I'm not worried about privacy, I've got nothing to hide, are the people that they're not the marginalized sections of the population. They're not the vulnerable people in the population. They perhaps do have less to fear from an erosion of privacy or an erosion of privacy rights. And it's only when it becomes a very personal experience, so you apply for a job and you don't get it, and you knew that you were qualified and you're not sure why, and it might be because somebody was looking at what you'd posted on a social media site. Or you're denied some sort of welfare or social assistance, or you become the victim of identity theft. And those are the kinds of events that I think make it very real to people and sometimes convert the don't cares to the pragmatists or the pragmatists to the privacy fundamentalists.
I wonder if fundamentalist is the right word. Since fundamentalists, it suggests that they're starting from some principle and then deriving their position from that, some fundamental principle. When what you're saying suggests that people are becoming more concerned, and perhaps fundamentalist isn't the right word, concerned or something like that. But I take it this was taken from the literature.
Well, this is from Weston's construct in his surveys, so, and they've been updated periodically to get a sense of trends, so this is not my idea. I mean, I think what it's intended to capture are those people, at least at that moment in time when they're responding to the survey, who feel very strongly that privacy is an important value, whether it's subordinates any other interests or values. It's not clear, but it's a very, very important value that they're very unwilling to compromise. And then that's, it's probably part of our psychological makeup, if I were to speculate, that some people have a greater intrinsic interest in protecting privacy than others, right? Just like many other aspects of personality.
Can I comment on the attitudes?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the issue of, have attitudes changed? And this is actually now a field of study, and there are these types of quantitative examinations, and I'm not going to speak to those. I think the attitudes have changed, and the only way I can really get at this meaningfully is with the thought experiment. And I think if you went back 25 years or 30 years and you said to people, in 20 years' time, the state is going to have, there will be cameras on every street corner, that corporations and security agencies will be able to read your primary form of communication. They will track in minute detail your location and your consumption patterns. I think people would have said, there's no way in hell that's going to happen. That I find that objectionable, that is anti-democratic, and I will do something about it. And here we are 25 or 30 years later, and we haven't meaningfully done much about it. We've allowed these things to happen, we've regulated them at the margins, and so I think even just that speaks to, I think, the process of, what sociologists might call normalization, that we're able to normalize things. And it's not just normalize, I don't want to say we're normalizing bad things, that a lot of people embrace these things because they also bring with them a lot of benefits. It's not like, I think that's been the big surprise for a lot of people, is that we thought that surveillance would come wrapped up in the cloak of Big Brother, when in fact it's come wrapped up in the cloak of play and efficiency and entertainment, which has kind of complicated the picture that I think a lot of people have. I think there's definitely been a change of attitude, a normalization, an embrace of a lot of these things.
One of the speakers from the University of Haifa was talking about how, overwhelmingly people prefer targeted ads.
Yes.
You only get targeted ads when, in some sense, they're gathering information about you, but they click on targeted ads 3 times as often. I want to return to social media because you mentioned that before. How has social media affected contemporary surveillance? Is it the case, as some people say, that we're now spying on each other as much as any big brother?
Yeah, can I connect that back just to the last question?
Sure, you can
before
connect
Yeah,
it back.
great. Because I want to come back to the point that Stephen made, and I think it really works well in parallel with comments from Jill and Kevin, that actually, I would argue that many of these concerns, today, speaking about surveillance, really aren't concerns about an authoritarian society at all. Because in one respect, the proliferation of new technologies also kind of works against those agencies of control. There's way too much information out there. It's just as difficult for them to, figure out ways to, cut off one source of information, control information. It's like the Hydra. You cut off one means, but another one will pop up someplace else. So there is, when we look at new media technologies, there are those moments for empowerment as well. It was much easier to be authoritarian when all you had to worry about was state control of, radio and television broadcasting than what we have today. There are just too many points of entry. So going back to this question of attitudes, I really like the way that Jill mentioned that, first of all, we have to look at who's being asked that question, because it speaks directly to questions of social, cultural, and political power that we tend to forget that, even in democratic societies, there's a lot of social stratification, and there are people who have much more to be concerned about than others. And so for many, they do look at, this new circulation of two-way, three-way, multiple forms of multi-directional flows of information as convenient. As you've mentioned, there are numerous studies that show people like having things personalized to them, whether it's a pop-up ad, because it's convenient, it's efficiency. So I think the question becomes, what do we sacrifice for efficiency? Do we just become individualized and fragmented as opposed to parts of larger public spheres? So I wanted to, really connect these because I think it's been really productive to move away from the Orwellian view of new surveillances and to look at those micro instances of power and resistance in relation to new technologies. It's never an either-or situation. Now, social media really when I think of privacy, surveillance, visibility, and social media, it really comes back to that issue of what I was, what I'd thrown out there about this idea of the presentation and management of the self. That when we, look at comments on Twitter in 140 characters versus, what you're posting on your Facebook page, et cetera, is that these things may seem very innocuous to most people. But it's fascinating when you start talking, in lectures or with research groups, et cetera, about the fact that these aren't just momentary conversations. They last forever. You can't erase your Facebook profile permanently. That something that seems like an innocuous comment on Twitter can have major ramifications in terms of employment. That basically the whole world really is watching. Now, I'm not saying that everybody's reading everybody's Twitters, but it's much easier for employers, government officials, marketers, et cetera, to in effect, follow along, get an idea of who you are presenting yourself as in terms of a person, an embodied subject. And while these may seem ephemeral, there have been numerous cases in the past decade of students who have actually been suspended from universities for things that they have posted on Facebook that they thought were private, people who have lost their jobs. And maybe, some people will say maybe it was deserved or not because they would say to their employers that they were injured, but then they would post pictures of themselves, in Barbados, right? But the fact that, these things come back and haunt people in various different ways, and these are, in many ways, the most innocuous examples. There are, so where you're situated, how you're using social media, and how well informed you are about how the information about you is being used. And that, I think, is the difficult part, is that people really have no idea of how that information is being used. And when we're talking about young people, and going back to this idea of digital natives, millennials, et cetera, I think what we overlook is just, is just the fact of youth itself. I mean, if we think back to when we were all 10, 12 years old, we never thought ahead 20 years. About, well, if I say this and the whole world can see it, what will the, consequences of that action be? And when you start talking to young people about the fact that, with software, everything can be brought back. you can think you're deleting things, but it's still always out there to come back, that you actually have to be somewhat conscientious and thoughtful and think about that message that you're sending out there. These are the issues of visibility that I think are really coming to the forefront in terms of, the ways that we need to socialize ourselves. I mean, who reads, even when we're installing new software, all of that thing that says you must agree to the terms of, this? Most of us just click on it for convenience to immediately get the software loaded. Mm-hmm. So when we engage with social media, they're presenting, again, screens and screens and screens of this is what is going to happen to your information. How many people read it before they set up their account? Now, that said, it's our responsibility to be informed on those types of questions. But I think that, looking at how we socialize ourselves in these micro instances of engagement with social media are often, I think, more pressing than looking at some sort of totalitarian vision of socialization, of social media.
This morning in the panel from the Netherlands, they were talking about this recent EU case about the right to be forgotten. This Spanish businessman who, because the system, we used to be able to count on some level of you could, if you weren't the person you wanted to be when you were younger, you could change and you could reposition yourself. But with some of the social media, you can't. And it's not the right to have the information erased. It's the right to ask the indexes to delete the links. The newspaper stories won't go away, but the links in the indices need perhaps to be managed a little bit differently. Is there anyone else who'd like to talk about social media? And
I would. I would like to talk about social media.
Is there anyone who doesn't want to talk about social media?
Well, I think one of the things I'd like to go back to is this idea of visibility again, that Sarah is using the term visibility, and in my world we use the term transparency a lot. And certainly I've spoken a great deal about just including in the world of social media. I mean, obviously, people are putting far more information out there publicly than they ever did before. They're sharing on blogs and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all over the place. And they're voluntarily putting it out there. And of course, that makes it very, very easy for governments and businesses to collect that information. I have a number of concerns with that from a regulator point of view, and one of them is, is that because the information is in the public sphere and that's where it's being collected from, that's sort of eroding the direct connection between, say, government or business or the collector and the data subject. So most privacy laws are based on fair information principles that, and we'll probably get to this, the idea of notice and consent. So individuals know the purpose for which their information was collected and they're able to exercise some sort of choice. They can consent to that collection. When the information is not collected directly from the individual, then from my point of view as a regulator with a mandate to ensure that individuals can exercise their rights under privacy law, this poses a problem. Those rights under privacy law include asking for access to that information. It's very hard to ask for access to that information if you don't know it's even been collected, or you don't know who's collected it, and you don't know who it's been shared with. You can't make a complaint to my office. So I mentioned earlier that part of our mandate is to resolve complaints. So individuals will contact us and say, well, my former employer shared this information with my new employer and that's prevented me from getting a job. I know from conversations I've had with all sorts of regulated entities that information is being collected from social media sites. If you use that information to make a decision about an individual and you don't choose to interview them or give them a job as a result of that, more often than not, the individual doesn't know that that's why. So, we're starting now to see some complaints coming in that involve social media technologies, but more often than not, that there's this problem about visibility or transparency, that individuals don't know the information's been collected, so they can't exercise those rights. And another concern that I wanted to mention with respect to social media is kind of going back to what Kevin was saying. If you'd asked people some years ago if they were willing to submit to all sorts of tracking, whether they would say, what they would say is, no, I'm going to stand up for my my fundamental rights. When you think about a smartphone, which is a device, again, that people voluntarily carry with them, that tracks everybody that you call, it's got all your pictures on it, it's got all your closest family connections, it's got all of this, all your passwords for every other system that you might have access, have an account with, and people voluntarily carry that with them. And now there's the ability to for geolocation tracking, and that is a concern for me because, once you're able to start mapping all of this information, and I know that also, some public bodies and the open government movement to push data sets of information out there, which are more often than not de-identified. They're anonymized, but there's often, they want to be able to map that information. So there's the spatial code. This is a way of linking it all together and bringing all that information back together, and potentially the ability to profile individuals. So that's one of the things I find very interesting about social media is the degree to which it all hinges on this smartphone that we all carry with us. It contains everything about us, our entire lives, and it can now all be mapped.
I agree with the comments that have been made to the extent that there are clear information asymmetries in many cases and power differentials when it comes to information, especially with respect to young people who more than even adults can be impulsive and have deficits in terms of making long-term rational calculations and things coming back to haunt them. And there are justifications for regulation and intervention and education and socialization on all of those grounds. But I think one piece of this hasn't been spoken of yet, and that's what you might call like having your cake and eating it too problem. Because privacy fundamentally is an aspect of self-interest. And I don't say that derisively, because most things are aspects of self-interest. And so we want privacy when it benefits us, and we want privacy when it's free, but when we see the downside of privacy, or when it costs us, then we start making trade-offs. And so disclosure and access and dissemination are very important values and interests in our society. They provide tremendous social benefits. So we post things on Facebook because we think it's going to enhance our reputation, help us to make productive social and economic connections, and do all kinds of wonderful things. And in some cases, we may calculate incorrectly, and information will come back to haunt us in some way. But at some point, there's a trade-off there, and we have to balance one against the other. So we can't forget that access to information, which is another part of your work, Jill, and that disclosure and dissemination are positive social goods. So for example, I might not want my youth criminal record easily accessible, but if I'm a parent or the owner or operator of a daycare or a school administrator, I want to know if someone has a criminal record who's going to be working with children. I want to know, rightly or wrongly, if there's a registered sex offender in my neighborhood. So we as a society, I think, have to look at all of these questions in their context and then make the best determination that we can as to whether or not the privacy value should be the one that prevails, and then justify that, or if instead we have to sacrifice some degree of privacy in order to attain these other objectives.
So I want to switch us over to big data now, go from social media to big data. Some people have pointed out that, a lot of the information we had about the public society until recently was based on essentially sampling, polling and sampling. Now all of a sudden we have the capacity to have complete data. In fact, almost too much data. I think Stephen was sort of hinting at the fact that the sheer quantity may itself actually become a hindrance. But big data seems to me not just a question of quantity, but actually to have changed something to be a question of degree. So let me turn to Kevin. Do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, thank you. The big data issue. I struggle, to tell the truth, with whether there's anything new here. Because for years and years and years I've listened to, we were able to collect more and more data and more and more data and more and more data. And now we're saying we can collect more and more data. I just wonder if there's really a threshold that we've passed that maybe we didn't pass some time ago. The reality is the amount of data that's now collected and collectible is astronomical. It's almost unfathomable. And this is one of the real difficulties, certainly in my field, when we try and talk about surveillance, particularly data valence, monitoring people through data, is just trying to get people to understand, or even to get ourselves to understand, the amount of data that's out there that's collectible. And one of my favorite examples that I use all the time is the National Security Agency, which is, it collects signals intelligence in the United States, became a very prominent player in the war on terrorism after 9/11. And so they collect information on email and cell phone communications, and they are, until several NSA colloquially, until fairly recently, stood for no such agency, because that was how the government in the United States responded whenever you asked about the NSA. They said there's no such agency. Now we know there is such an agency a lot, and we know, starting to get snippets about how it works through the Snowden revelations, and it works through collecting almost mind-boggling amounts of information. And there was a document that a colleague of mine collected. It was a confidential document by the NSA, and they predicted that by 2015, they were going to be processing personal data at the level of the yottabyte. And so what does that mean? Well, if you're a mathematician, your jaw just kind of dropped on the floor. But essentially, the yottabyte, to get your head around it, as of 2000, I think it's 2011 let's say 2011, if you combine the computing power of every single computer on Earth, it did not have a yottabyte's worth of capability. So we're talking about mind-boggling abilities to collect information. How effective they are in using this, we're not allowed to know, which is actually, this goes back to Steve's point about democracy. This is one of the real dilemmas, particularly in areas like the NSA, where you've essentially seen the emergence of a shadow state, a non-democratic shadow state that's based on collecting information, that works very hard not to reveal what it does. And there's good reasons when you are a security agency not to reveal things, but the lengths to which they have gone to be non-democratic is astounding, to reveal what they do, and the amount of information they collect is astounding. So I think there's a lot here in terms of the amount of information being collected. I struggle to some extent whether this is just the latest fad, that we're all talking about big data, and are we all going to be talking about big data in 3 or 4 years from now, or is this just more of the same?
Well, in addition, whether or not it's the latest fad, there are certainly companies that are presenting themselves and presenting services and are benefiting from this fad, both within the security community and outside. We heard from one of the people in the Israeli panel about IBM marketing tools right to the retail level that allow you to figure out who your customers are. I've got to say, I personally think one of the things we're learning from the Snowden revelations is that it's not working for counterterrorism. That every one of the case examples that you see that seems interesting is actually for spying on politicians, where you're not trying to figure out who could be, but who you want to track, whether it's. But that's speculation. Is there someone else who'd like to? Jill, would you like to talk a little bit about big data?
Well, I just want to pick up on what Kevin said. I completely agree with Kevin that I don't think that anybody, or very few people, have actually realized the full potential of big data. So big data being not just about the volumes of mind-boggling amount of information that can be collected, but it's also about bringing technologies and analytical abilities to that information to predict behaviors and to cure diseases and for all sorts of potentially beneficial purposes. What I agree with Kevin in is that I don't think there's very many who are actually doing that, who are able to bring those technologies to bear. And which is where I get to, I don't think that the full potential of big data has been realized yet. On the other hand, I think that big data in some ways is a game changer because that potential is there and it's held out. This is the carrot. the fact that we don't necessarily, or few have the analytical ability to make big data work for us in all its full glory doesn't mean that the information is not being collected. And the information being collected just brings me back to what I was saying before, that again, do individuals know that it's being collected, and who's got it, and who's storing it, and who's maintaining it, and then again, vast repositories of information. You know, we start to see information breaches, security breaches. And it was one thing when it was, you know, a hard copy file from, say, a doctor's office that went missing or was blowing in the wind somewhere. It's quite another thing when it's a massive database that has been hacked into, and there's just this vast amount of information affecting hundreds of thousands of people, and it's all stored on a, you know, USB stick that goes missing, or a laptop computer that goes missing. So unfortunately, I think some of the issues and the problems and the risks of big data were there because the information is being collected and it's being matched and it's being warehoused. Are we yet at the point where we can realize some of the benefits? We've still got a ways to go there. But I do think just because of the collection of the information, it's a bit of a game changer at this point, and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
If I could just add something to Kevin's point about the NSA. I mean, this is, I think, a real problem that the Snowden revelations have really brought into focus. And that is that whatever the merits and demerits of big data collection by state agencies like the NSA, and whether, you know, we've got the balance right in terms of privacy protection and security, you know, the level of transparency that existed with respect to the NSA, or even the Canadian equivalent, CSEC, was close to zero. And that was a problem. It was a problem because now we can see what they were doing, and we can make judgments, right, politically and civil society, as to whether or not we think it's appropriate. So now we have a movement in the U.S. Congress, a bipartisan movement, to introduce legislation, and it's, you know, just before the House right now, and who knows what it'll end up looking like. But, you know, there is a strong social and political movement to put greater checks and balances on the NSA. I wish we had something like that in Canada, because a lot of people don't realize that our organization, the equivalent of the NSA in Canada, has less oversight, and especially judicial oversight, than the NSA does. At least in the United States, there's nominal judicial oversight. Many would argue that it's not particularly rigorous or comprehensive, but there is nominal judicial oversight before the fact of almost everything the NSA does. In Canada, that's simply not the case. There's no judicial oversight before the fact whatsoever, which I think is a massive problem and a constitutional issue that I think will eventually end up in, actually it is before the courts right now in British Columbia. So I completely agree with Kevin that, you know, we do have to have a greater handle, recognizing inevitably that there will be considerable secrecy with respect to national security surveillance. We nevertheless need to have sufficient checks and balances, and for that to work, the public needs to know, at least in general terms, the types of surveillance mechanisms, the types of data collection that are going on.
Would you agree that we also need to have some sense, or we need to be assured that somebody is looking at the costs and the benefit? Because, you know, some of the critics of the NSA are saying that the amount of money being spent, and it's just cannot be justified in terms of the counter-terrorist successes that they may or may not have had. And now, obviously, information about their budgets is itself something that probably has to be guarded. But I guess I would like to be reassured that somebody is asking the question, you know, is this a good use of money?
I'll chime in here sort of an oblique way, because I think one of the interesting things, certainly after 9/11, I think the issue, what we're talking about here, is really the issue of trust. Because certainly after 9/11, there was a willingness on behalf of a significant portion of the population, I think, to trust the government. That there were real concrete risks, we'd seen them manifest, and we were willing to trust the government that they would do the right thing. And I think that's starting to wane. And I think that so what the Snowden revelations kind of revealed, and this is a very long-standing story in any system of espionage, is that when you have a closed system that's run extremely secretively, when we start to get snippets of how it actually operates in practice, we inevitably find out that there's always partisan political dynamics in terms of the information that's collected, who's monitored. It's not just about managing risk, but it's about managing risks to your own personal and institutional self-interest that go on here. And I think that we're at the point now where these security agencies are sort of saying, trust us. We can't tell you how successful we're being, but we're being really successful. And I think that that's a problem. But it's really in some ways a difficult problem to solve because they can't lay all their cards on the table. They can't tell you about all of their successes because you burn contacts, you burn informants, all that kind of stuff. So it's a real conundrum. But I think you're starting to see a shift in the dynamics of trust, certainly since 9/11, where there was much more trust in the integrity of the information collection system, where I think there's a little more suspicion now about what's really going on here. Is this justifiable? Can you show me that it's justifiable? And the cost issues are kind of monumental.
So I'd like to start switching us over to talking about change. And in particular, I'd like to start with a question about law and legal structures, and maybe turn to Jill and then Stephen. Can laws make a difference? Can legal structures constrain these technologies of surveillance, or at least hold them accountable?
That's a very good question. Let's hope so, at least to some extent. And certainly we believe that and we try, but laws are not perfect. One thing I would say about laws, and just going back to a comment that Sarah had made earlier about technology, and you can't know all, but privacy laws are well, certainly ones in Alberta, I'll speak to those, are intended to be technology neutral. So they're not about this is a good thing or this is a bad thing. And they're not super specific, which some people don't like, but that's because if you tried to make them super specific and say these are the kinds of safeguards you need to have in place to deal with a particular technology, that would be obsolete and outdated within a day sort of idea. So instead what you have are access and privacy laws that are based on fair information principles or practices generally. And those go back to kind of the late 70s, early 80s, and the OECD, their guidelines for the protection of privacy and transborder flows of personal data. And those basic principles, we've already touched on some of those. They have to do with notice. So you have to tell people that you're collecting personal information and generally collect it from them so they know that you've collected it. You have to tell them the purpose for which you're collecting it, and you have to limit your use of that information to the purpose for which you collected it. So, and then there are other principles, but those ones in particular seem to be under fire or under criticism lately. In the last few years, there's definitely been a discussion around what is commonly referred to as notice and consent, those provisions of privacy laws, and whether or not they are in fact workable. And those who would advocate for a change in legal frameworks would argue that privacy notices are too complex and nobody reads them. They're too bureaucratic. The focus is too much on notice and consent as opposed to how the information is used. And we need to, take a different look at this, eliminate or reduce this idea of purpose specification, because especially in the age of big data, there it is again, it's often big data that's pushing some of these thoughts, that purpose specification doesn't work with big data, because you want to be able to collect all of this information and analyze it, and you have no idea what use you might want to put that information to in the future that will be of great benefit to society. And so along with this is also sort of a move to shift accountability away from individuals. Right now, individuals having some accountability through the exercise of their rights, access, and the ability to make complaints, to the data users, to the data collectors, to hold them to a particular standard or to make them liable for any harms that might occur after the fact. So there's been an interesting debate on these issues in recent years. To some extent, I do get it, and again, Sarah's made this point already. Who does read the entire privacy policy or the notice and consent, or when you get a new app for your smartphone, do you really look into what it's doing with your personal information and where that information is being shared? And I think it might be too much sometimes to ask of people when you consider just how connected we are, and you could spend half of your life reading these things to try to truly understand what it is that you're consenting to. So, to some extent, I have some sympathy for this idea that notice and consent and privacy laws that are based solely on notice and consent don't really, perhaps, match up with the world as we see it today and the way information is flowing. I will say that, one of the laws in Alberta, I mentioned that I have oversight for 3, the public sector, private sector, and health sector legislation. Our health sector legislation is probably the closest one to the model, to this use model idea. So the idea in Alberta's health legislation, Health Information Act, is that information should be shared amongst the people who need to have access to it, and certain uses have been predefined and they're set out in the legislation, so to provide treatment and care. So if I'm living in Edmonton but I'm injured in Lethbridge, a healthcare provider providing services to me in another city will have access to that information because they'll need it for these predefined purposes. When you have that kind of information sharing, you have to balance it. And what's happened in Alberta's health legislation, again, no laws are perfect, but that is balanced with other kinds of controls, so things like mandatory privacy impact assessments. And I think that might be a tool taken out of the health sector and into the private sector and the public sector. The idea that you have to do a privacy impact assessment before you introduce one of these new information systems or before you match information systems together. Privacy impact assessment requiring you to figure out what your legal authority is, what are you trying to achieve here, what are the risks, how are you going to privacy, how are you going to mitigate those risks, how are you going to govern this information structure. So I think that there are some, there's some merit to this argument that notice and consent doesn't really work. Do I think that our laws are completely insufficient and should be tossed out? No. There's probably some way of recognizing the realities of information flows and building in controls like privacy impact assessments or disclosure logs or whatever it might be to allow for some oversight for these kinds of information systems.
Stephen.
Well, I think the short answer to your question, can legal structures constrain these technologies, is yes, although they're by no means a complete answer. There's only so much that law can do. But I'll maybe talk a little bit in the abstract about what law can achieve in the realm of privacy protection. To the extent that people experience invasions of their privacy as being intrinsically harmful or instrumentally harmful, they're often going to do something right? They're going to avoid certain kinds of activities that they think are going to come back to stigmatize them if they're being monitored in some way, or they'll use some of their own resources to erect barriers or defensive measures to protect their privacy. They may use encryption, they may build fences, they may go around wearing masks. It's probably a silly example, but they're going to do something about it. And some of those things are inefficient and wasteful and costly. And you consider, for example, the threat of eavesdropping, of wiretapping. What would be the chief effect of eliminating legal protections over wiretapping? Well, it wouldn't be necessarily that the state would learn that much more about us, because we would all take countermeasures and we would stop talking to one another candidly. We would stop using our cell phones. We might have a resurgence of public payphones. Who knows, right? But these are not good things. We don't want these things to happen. We want to foster trust so we can communicate candidly and without the fear that the state or our neighbors are listening in. So what law can do then is provide that bedrock of trust that allows us to engage in productive social activities and communications and avoids wasteful spending on what you might call sort of defensive measures to protect your privacy. Now, to talk a little bit about what was previously mentioned in terms of what's the best model for regulation. I'm most familiar with regulating the state in its law enforcement and national security mandates against the invasions of privacy of individual citizens. And there I do think you're seeing a subtle shift over time between legal restrictions like warrants or judicial authorizations that take place before information is collected to restrict the ability of law enforcement and state agents to gain information about us, to methods of controlling the use or dissemination of that information after the fact. Now, there will always be a very important place for warrants with respect to particularly sensitive information. So I mentioned communications, electronic and oral communications. We don't want those intercepted. We have very rigorous legal tools to prevent that from happening, or to require the state to justify those kinds of intercepts under very rigorous standards. But in terms of less sensitive information, we've talked for a decade or more about data valence, about data mining, about data aggregation, about cloud computing, and about big data. The ability of, whether it's organizations in the private or public sector, to collect little bits of information about us that, looked at individually, may be fairly innocuous, but when aggregated and algorithms are applied, it can paint a fairly detailed picture of potentially intimate activities. And I think the best way to regulate that is not to stop the collection of the information in the first place, because that often has, counterproductive effects, and the ability of the state to gather preliminary investigative information that may be very crucial to dealing with very real social problems like crime. But instead to have, I think, more rigorous and comprehensive oversight mechanisms at the back end to ensure that the information is not being abused, it's not being used in a discriminatory way for racial profiling, for example, is not being kept for an inordinate period of time, is not being used for unauthorized secondary purposes. And so you have that kind of auditing and oversight and accountability at the back end in conjunction with the traditional front-end warrant and authorizations.
Would you guys like to add to this?
Well, I can jump in because I maybe predictably take sort of a different tack on sort of regulation and law, particularly around surveillance. And I guess the question is sort of how useful is law in regulating surveillance depends, I think, to some extent on what you hope the law would do. And I guess at one point in time, I had hoped that the law would be a more effective check on the expansion of surveillance, on the rise of a society where surveillance is kind of a cornerstone of almost everything. And I think that if that's your hope, you're just mistaken. The law is not capable of doing that. I think what the law can do is that it can mitigate some of the more egregious uses of the information that's collected, whether that's data or textual or visual, et cetera, et cetera. I think that the types of things that Stephen were talking about, are they unauthorized? Are they appropriate? Are they viable? All that kind of stuff I think the law can be useful for. But in terms of checking what I often call a whole series of surges of surveillance, I don't think the law, all of this expansion of surveillance has occurred under legal regimes. It has occurred and has essentially been legally authorized before the fact or after the fact. So I think that if your ambitions are that you will check the expansion of surveillance generally, I don't think the law is up to the task, even remotely. But I think the law actually can be useful in checking egregious uses of information, unfair uses, things that are not in all kinds of policies. I think, going back to the issues about notice and consent, I think they are absolutely broken. I just don't think they work at all. I just take the example of notice. And I use the example of notice cameras in the UK. If anyone's been to the United Kingdom in the last 10 or 15 years, you know that cameras in the United Kingdom are essentially ubiquitous in any urban center. And one of the ways they've tried to regulate this is, there's signage. So there's notice everywhere you go. The problem with that is, we're talking about, first of all, very sophisticated cameras. Some of these can sort of read your cell phone over your shoulder, your text messages from like 200 meters away. We're talking very sophisticated technologies. So the problem with notice, first of all, is there's no alternative. There is no downtown that you could go to. Now I know that they're doing surveillance here, I won't go there. And the whole basis of notice was that if you know, you can change your behavior. Well, that's just not true. And from my perspective, notice doesn't solve the problem of, I don't want to be notified. I don't want someone to read my text over my shoulder. So notice does nothing for me. And I, similar kind of problems with consent. Consent, is essentially meaningless in a society where it's become a precondition to engage with organizations to surrender your information. If you want to fly, if you want to be in an educational institution, if you want to shop, there's a quid pro quo now about surrendering information. So you may or may not consent, but you're probably going to be surrendering that information, even if you did read those, some of them are 64 pages long, all those consent policies, you'd probably still check okay, because the alternative would be to not be using these products and these services, which some of them are, the cornerstone of sociability now. Facebook, it's very hard to get off Facebook. When you hear people talking about this, God, I wish I could just get off Facebook, but you lose all kinds of contacts and events, etc. So I think notice and consent are really kind of broken, and we're thinking about alternative structures.
The point about consent is really interesting, because the whole definition of consent has changed in terms of new technologies. I want to sort of reinforce, the central point that just Kevin raised here. To refuse consent, and basically, there's no negotiation. It's not like you can say, oh, well, I agree with what's on page 35 and consent to that, but I don't want to consent to what's on page 62. Okay, that means I can't update my Microsoft Word. These fundamental things. If you refuse to consent, and it's always on the terms of the person that is so-called delivering the services, then you don't get that service at all. You cannot participate. And it's not just about Facebook or being, sociability. It's also about being able to put the technology onto your computer that allows you to do your job. So to say, when we say we're clicking on consent, I think it's becoming increasingly farcical.
I don't know about you guys. I always click on these things, but
Yeah.
I think there's some of these sources that I read will then tell me what I've clicked on. So the other day I was just reading about DuckDuckGo, and it was somebody had written a good article explaining how they don't gather the data that Google does, and so and right there was a button I could click, and so lo and behold, one of my mini laptops now doesn't use Google. Whether I get around to checking the others. I want to also say that I quit Facebook in 2005, and I have no social life. I spend all my time here.
Did you have one before?
And I should add, and we're getting into the closing moments here, but I should add that when our firstborn went off to university, those of you who've been parents know that you go from knowing too much about their lives to knowing nothing. And there's a sort of a bit of a vacuum. So we haunted him on Facebook, and our second-born watched what we were doing. Like, we'd cuddle around and we'd speculate about his life. And she never allowed my wife or I, to be her friend. She watched the surveillance, this sort of family surveillance, and never did. My last question is about the benefits and dangers of the surveillance revolution. And I'd like to, we've talked about some of the dangers, we've talked about some of the possible solutions or whether or not the law can do, but I'd like to also spend a moment to talk about some of the benefits. What are we getting out of this? And perhaps, Stephen, let's start with you. Let's give everyone a chance to talk about this.
Well, I think we've talked a little bit about some of the benefits in terms of the commercial world and having tailored and targeted advertising and greater choice in terms of the goods and services that we'd like to learn about. I think most people enjoy the convenience from that. And I guess I'd like to return a little bit to the question of surveillance and national security. And this is a really difficult and vexing question, because I think we're naive if we think that terrorist threat is not monumental and existential. It may have receded a little bit compared to what it was like in 2001, but all it takes is one bomb to go off, in the Western world, and all of this is off the table, right? And so that threat may be small in terms of the probability of its occurrence, but the magnitude of harm in terms of, the terror that it actually propagates in the population, and then all of a sudden people are willing to throw their civil liberties away, civil society really becomes under threat potentially. It's hard for me to sit back and say, the NSA and CSEC, they're way too powerful, they're way too scary, who knows what they're using this information for. So I said before that we need checks and balances and we need transparency, but at the same time, I'm happy that they're there. And it may be difficult, and I'm not enough of an expert to say, to point to individual successes that are concrete, that are tangible, that are not subject to confidentiality and secrecy. But, you know, I think we see in the news every day that there are people out there in the world who want to kill us, you know, in the most violent way possible. And so I think surveillance and the widespread kind of mass surveillance, as long as it's subject to a significant degree of oversight and limitation, is inevitable and necessary and possibly a good thing. So there's that.
Okay. Jill?
So the question,
Benefits.
benefits and dangers of the
benefits.
surveillance revolution. Possible benefits. Well, I think that one of the important concepts that was brought up today was something that I think Kevin actually opened with, and I think that is to realize that when we talk about surveillance, which is a very value-laden term in many ways, that it's not necessarily just about police and, what did you say, James Bond and spies and police, which I think is what a lot of people think of when they hear the word surveillance. But it does, you know, there are all sorts of benefits, and we've talked about a lot of them here today. There are benefits in terms of getting, you know, advertising for the things that you really, really want. There's a downside to that. You're not exposed to anything except the things that you already, you know, have some sort of proclivity to. There are, you know, potentially all sorts of benefits to, you know, curing disease, and anyway, there are lots of benefits. But there is that downside, and I'll go back to the you know, I mentioned a Supreme Court decision that talked about privacy and privacy being fundamental to democracy and a free society. And we've had a few examples coming out today about how people will change their behavior because they know they're being watched, and there's this, and young people might not be able to ever get away from some of those bad decisions that they make in life. So, you know, there's pros and cons, and some surveillance obviously is necessary to protect against terrorism. You know, Stephen is absolutely right when he says that, you know, the threat may not be as grand as is sometimes portrayed, especially when someone's trying to push through a surveillance type bill, but there is some sort of threat. And, you know, to some extent, we've talked about privacy laws in their existing form, and that maybe being based on notice and consent, that doesn't really seem to be workable, but there are merits to legislation. To some extent, legislation does try to balance, you know, real things like threats and the need to do police investigations. There are some, you know, that is built into, that balancing is built into most privacy laws. There are certain disclosures of information to police for bona fide investigations. There's information that doesn't have to be made public if there's a request for access, because it would be a threat to national security or would compromise you know, our police and law enforcement activities. So, you know, I think conversations like this, one of the benefits of the surveillance revolution is that we're having these conversations, and I think this is one way of contributing to, you know, increased awareness of both the pros and the cons of surveillance.
Well, Sarah.
I would begin by saying costs and benefits. Who benefits from it? That's the fundamental question that I don't think is asked often enough. I mean, I want to respectfully disagree in a bit with this issue about surveillance is vital because we live in a more dangerous world. Mainly because I think that has been a very useful political tool to allow for surveillance creep, which is to move it out of those domains of, you know, global security and into people's everyday lives, because now you have the technologies and the means, and you've created a culture of fear that increasingly makes people amenable to being surveyed. I mean, we saw what happened post 9/11 when Homeland Security expanded all of these issues, and people said, this will keep us safe, so I'm fine with profiling, I'm fine with this, you know, happening at airports, et cetera. Well, I'm not saying that, that there aren't, global hotspots and that there are problems in the world, but that these technologies don't stay located where they were initially always targeted to be. They expand. They enter into people's everyday lives. So I would say, to say costs and benefits is coming back to that normative, I think we need to look at sort of every instance of what are the justifications? Who's benefiting from that particular, strategy of surveillance? And how is it linked to either empowering particular types of activities and people or limiting people's mobility and consequences in economic, political, and cultural spheres. So I guess I'm far less definitive. Oh, it's really important that we have surveillance here because it's innately beneficial, because there's always going to be a spin-off from these technologies and being watched. I mean, it's often the most innocuous aspects that people don't really consider. As Jill mentioned, many questions around surveillance, visibility, and privacy has been about self-disciplining. That really does work effectively for governments. When people just start to discipline themselves, self-survey, so they actually limit their own actions and mobility, well, then you don't have to invest as much in policies that might have them behave in ways that you would like to have them behave. So there's that. So I'm being provocative here because I think it's far more complex than surveillance is really important here, it's dangerous here. I think these are all very interconnected spheres. I would even say targeted advertising is not unproblematic. If you look at the way the media industries work, content, the types of stories we see produced, the types of news that gets covered is intricately connected to advertising interests. And advertisers are only really interested in particular types of groups. And they produce content for those types of groups. And so the more information we have about advertisers finding the most privileged groups and only supporting content that really sort of speaks to those people cuts off enormous amounts of information and entertainment that may speak to people who are less represented in society, which really gets moves us away from any notion of a public sphere of media, information, and entertainment as well. So advertising is not unproblematic. It's the engine that runs the media industries increasingly around the world. Who might unconditionally benefit? Well, I'm not appearing, I don't want to appear facetious here, but I think maybe parents. Maybe they're really the ones that benefit the most. We always know where our kids are now, whereas, I know that my parents never knew where we were.
Well, it's not surveillance technology, but certainly Skype made a real difference to be able to see your children when they're far away. When I went off to college, I wrote a letter once a term, and only because I knew I'd be in trouble and I wouldn't get Christmas presents if I didn't.
If I could just respond very briefly to something that you mentioned, you sort of beg the question of, well, who benefits? Well, who does benefit? Like, why is it? Is the Canadian government or governments trying to control us through surveillance? We live in a democratic society. Even in the case of the UK, now I'm not sure I personally would want to live in a city or society where there are interconnected cameras, practically everywhere, as is the case in many cities in the UK. Creeps me out a little bit, but where's the evidence that that's stulted the democratic process in the UK? Where's the evidence there's a mass sort of movement against this kind of surveillance? They seem to like it.
Well,
there are abuses. There are problems that need to be mitigated and discussed, but it doesn't seem to have led to any kind of, let alone a Big Brother state, but any kind of accretion of power or marginalization of certain groups, or even, I would suggest, any large-scale chill or deterrence of behaviors or activities. Like I haven't seen the evidence of that, even in that sort of extreme form. So I think we have to be careful about appealing to these notions of an all-powerful state or corporate interests or, some kind of transformation in our society because of surveillance. I think you really have to draw the lines of causality carefully and demonstrate empirically that these things are happening. In my view, I don't see the evidence for it.
Well, if I could try to answer that, I think the inverse is also true. We haven't seen demonstrated the empirical evidence that predictive analytics outperforms human intelligence. A massive amount of money, close to billions of dollars, has been invested since 9/11 in the gathering the data and then trying to process it and do predictive analytics. And the quants are now publishing papers saying, well, predictive analytics, when you have such a small number of true positives as opposed to false positives, doesn't work. 9/11 was not a problem of missing intelligence. It was that the intelligence wasn't being followed up and being shared. So the empirical evidence, I would say, is actually on why are we spending all this money on gathering the data when, in fact, we do know that human intelligence works, if you're concerned.
Right. Well, then I think the question becomes, what is the process, what is the best process that we can have to evaluate the costs and benefits of surveillance and whether or not these investments are worthwhile in the short term or the long term?
And I think something that interests me is, I think there are real potential benefits for certain types of big data in health outcomes. And, Glenn Greenwald actually does a comparison of how much money is being spent for, in effect, counterterrorism and how much is being spent on, if you will, medical surveillance, and points out that, there's a lot more people dying of heart attacks than terrorism, and perhaps we need to find a balance there. So again, that's empirical. We can look at the amount of money being spent per citizen. We can ask what are statistically the chances that you're going to have, that you're going to encounter or that you're going to die from one cause or another. And then ask, is this a good use of money? Which I think gets back to your initial point. We need to do these sort of cost-benefit analysis. We need to have these conversations. Now, I realize I've just sort of done what chairs shouldn't do, which is get excited and leap in. So I'm going to pass it over to Kevin for the last word.
Sure. So last word, I think, is on, we're talking about benefits and risks. I think to really understand the benefits of surveillance, or the potential benefits, you have to understand the relationship between surveillance or visibility and knowledge. Because often, when you talk about visibility, you're talking about knowing. You're talking about knowing things. Sight and knowledge in Western societies are really kind of tightly related. So this sight-knowledge kind of nexus leads to all kinds of possibilities for greater efficiencies, particularly in organizations. You can produce things faster, more efficiently, at less cost, just-in-time kind of delivery. All of that becomes possible. So there's almost every organization can do things better, hypothetically, at less cost with greater surveillance. So there's all kinds of possibilities there. I want to think about dangers or risks at two different levels. And I think the first one is the one that we usually talk about, is there's the kind of risks to surveillance that are kind of typically framed in terms of privacy and rights and violations, and those are real. And, to go back to the question about, who's upset by cameras, nobody's upset. I think if you actually talk to racialized groups in London, they'll tell you a very different story as opposed, and this is where you started, Steve. You said, let's think about what groups here are affected by these things. They'll tell you a different story about being monitored on camera as opposed to sort of all of us at the panel. But the other risk here, and this is one where I'm always kind of reluctant to sort of go to because you can sort of get framed as a conspiracy kind of freak, but there is a danger in creating a society that's hardwired for surveillance. And it is the danger that if something goes wrong, even in a democratic society, environmental collapse, terrorism, et cetera, that all of those very disparate systems can suddenly be calibrated to identify particular groups. And you might find yourself on the outs of those groups, whether it's because of your religion or your skin color or your hair color or something you posted 7 years ago. You don't want to talk about that kind of stuff too much because you risk coming across as some sort of unhinged conspiracy theorist, which I'm not. But it is a latent risk in a society that is hardwired for surveillance that we can turn to them in times of crisis. So I'll just, maybe it's a glim point to end up on. So there's tremendous benefit in terms of relationship with knowledge, but there's also great risk.
Well, I don't want to, but I think it's time to end this conversation, because I know there are people elsewhere in the world who are going to join us for this Around the World conference on privacy and surveillance. I'd really like to thank you all. I really appreciate your coming and engaging in these questions. And I don't know if I told you this, but all this was recorded and will be archived. You knew that. So thank you all.